I was 7 years old when my parents left me alone in a Las Vegas casino bathroom and never came back. For 15 years, I thought they were dead. Then my rich aunt who raised me passed away, leaving me millions in inheritance. 3 days after the funeral, my dead parents showed up at my door with tears in their eyes, claiming they had searched for me everywhere. But when my aunt's lawyer revealed the private investigator reports he'd been keeping secret, the truth came out. My parents had been living just 2 hours away the entire time, and they had sold me to pay off their gambling debts. Before we dive into my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you've ever felt abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect you, hit that like button. You're not alone. My name is Elaine Hughes, and my childhood ended on a Tuesday afternoon in 1998 at the Golden Nugget Casino in Las Vegas. I remember every detail of that day with the kind of clarity that trauma burns into your memory forever. The smell of cigarette smoke mixed with industrial carpet cleaner. The constant electronic beeping of slot machines creating a soundtrack of false hope. The way my mother's hands shook as she counted crumpled bills from her purse for the 3rd time that hour. We had been living in Las Vegas for 6 months, moving from one cheap motel to another as my father chased what he called business opportunities and my mother called gambling winnings. To a 7-year-old, the constant moving felt like an adventure rather than the desperate downward spiral it actually was. I didn't understand that we had lost our house in Phoenix, that my father's construction business had failed, or that my parents were funding their casino visits by selling everything we owned. That Tuesday started like all the others. My parents woke up around noon, argued quietly about money while they thought I was still sleeping, then announced we were going somewhere fun. The Golden Nugget was our most frequent destination because it had an arcade area where children were technically allowed while their parents gambled nearby. I had become an expert at making $5 in quarters last for hours, playing the same games over and over while my parents disappeared into the main casino floor. But this day felt different from the moment we walked through the heavy glass doors. My mother kept checking her watch and whispering urgently to my father. My father was sweating despite the aggressive air conditioning, and he kept looking around the casino as if he was expecting someone specific to appear. They gave me $10 in quarters instead of the usual $5, told me to stay in the arcade area, and promised they would be back before the money ran out. I should have been excited about the extra quarters, but something in their voices made my stomach feel tight with worry. My mother hugged me longer than usual, and when she pulled away, her eyes were red like she had been crying. My father patted my head awkwardly and said something about being a good girl and listening to adults. Then they walked toward the main casino floor, and I went to my favorite racing game. An hour passed. Then 2 hours. My quarters were running low, and my parents were nowhere to be seen. I left the arcade area and searched the casino floor, weaving between slot machines and card tables, looking for familiar faces among the crowds of strangers. A security guard asked if I was lost, but I told him my parents were playing blackjack and would be back soon. It wasn't technically a lie since my parents often played blackjack, but as the afternoon stretched into evening, I began to suspect it wasn't the truth either. By 6 o'clock, I had used all my quarters and my parents had been gone for over 4 hours. The longest they had ever left me alone before was 90 minutes, and that was only because my mother had hit a small jackpot and lost track of time. I was getting hungry and scared, but I didn't know what to do. The security guard had asked about my parents twice more, and I was running out of convincing explanations for why 2 adults would leave a 7-year-old alone in a casino for an entire afternoon. That's when I decided to check the bathroom one more time. My mother had mentioned needing to use the restroom before they left, and part of me hoped she had gotten sick or lost track of time. The women's restroom was empty except for one stall that was locked, but no one answered when I knocked. I sat on the floor outside that stall for what felt like hours, convinced that my mother was inside and would eventually come out. It wasn't until a janitor found me asleep on the bathroom floor at 11 p.m. that anyone realized a child had been abandoned. The casino security called the police, who called Child Protective Services, who spent the next 3 days trying to locate my parents or any other family members. They found our motel room empty, with the rent unpaid and our few remaining belongings left behind. They found my father's truck in the casino parking lot with an envelope on the dashboard containing the keys and a note saying sorry. The police investigation revealed that my parents had accumulated massive gambling debts with several casinos and had been threatened by collection agencies. They had sold their car, their wedding rings, and most of our furniture to fund their gambling addiction. The final straw came when they borrowed money from what the police delicately called unsavory individuals who were not known for their patience with late payments. But what I didn't learn until 15 years later was that my abandonment had not been a moment of desperation or panic. It had been carefully planned and financially motivated. My parents had not disappeared to escape their debts. They had disappeared after settling those debts by selling something they thought had value. They had sold me. The person who bought me was my great-aunt Vivian Hughes, my mother's aunt who lived in a sprawling estate in Northern California. Aunt Vivian was a 60-year-old woman who had never married or had children, had built a successful interior design business over 30 years, and had been watching my parents' downward spiral with increasing alarm. When they contacted her with their proposition, she saw an opportunity to save a child from a terrible situation while also ensuring that child would have opportunities they could never provide. But I knew none of this at the time. All I knew was that after 3 days in foster care, an elegant woman in an expensive car came to collect me. She introduced herself as my great-aunt, explained that my parents had died in a car accident while driving to find help for our family's problems, and promised that she would take care of me from now on. She was kind but formal, treating me more like a traumatized house guest than a relative, and for the first few months, I waited every day for my parents to come back and explain that their deaths had been a mistake. Aunt Vivian's house was like something from a movie. 3 stories of perfectly decorated rooms, with gardens that required professional maintenance and a kitchen larger than most of the motel rooms where I had been living. My new bedroom was bigger than our entire apartment in Phoenix, with its own bathroom and enough space for toys I had only seen in store windows. For a 7-year-old who had been sleeping on motel couches and eating fast food for months, it felt like being transported to another planet. But the luxury came with rules and expectations that took time to understand. Aunt Vivian believed in education, discipline, and what she called proper behavior. I had private tutors to catch up on the schooling I had missed during our months of constant moving. I had piano lessons, art classes, and French instruction because she believed that well-rounded children became successful adults. I had a strict bedtime, limited television, and meals that were served at specific times with actual silverware and cloth napkins. The transition was difficult in ways that a 7-year-old couldn't articulate. I missed the chaos and unpredictability of life with my parents, even though I understood that my new life was objectively better. I missed my mother's impulsive hugs and my father's silly jokes, even though I also remembered the fear and uncertainty that had become constant during our final months together. Aunt Vivian was kind and patient, but she was not affectionate in the way my parents had been, and for a long time, I interpreted her emotional reserve as evidence that she didn't really want me. School was another adjustment that took months to navigate successfully. I started 3rd grade at an exclusive private school where most of my classmates had been friends since kindergarten and came from families with old money and social connections. My background was carefully sanitized for public consumption. I was the orphaned niece that generous Aunt Vivian had taken in after a tragic accident. No one mentioned casino bathrooms or gambling debts or the fact that I had been found sleeping on a restroom floor. The other children were polite but distant, unsure how to relate to someone with such a dramatically different background. Their problems involved piano recitals and tennis lessons and whether their parents would buy them the latest video game system. My problems involved nightmares about being abandoned again and a constant fear that if I misbehaved, Aunt Vivian would decide I was too much trouble and send me back to foster care. But as months turned into years, I began to understand that Aunt Vivian's emotional reserve was not rejection but protection. She had grown up in a family where displays of emotion were considered undignified, where love was demonstrated through actions rather than words. She showed her care by ensuring I had every educational advantage, every opportunity to develop talents and interests, every chance to build a successful future. She attended every school performance, helped with every homework assignment, and quietly dealt with any problems that arose. She also made sure I understood the value of financial independence and the importance of making smart decisions with money. By the time I was 12, I understood more about investments, business planning, and long-term financial strategy than most adults. Aunt Vivian had built her wealth through careful planning and hard work, and she was determined that I would have the knowledge and skills to maintain and grow whatever inheritance she eventually left me. The topic of my parents rarely came up in our conversations. Aunt Vivian had told me they died in the car accident, had shown me newspaper clippings about the crash, and had explained that their bodies had been too badly damaged for an open casket funeral. She said they had loved me very much but had been struggling with problems they couldn't solve, and that their deaths had been a tragic accident rather than an intentional abandonment. For years, I accepted this explanation without question. But as I got older, inconsistencies in the story began to bother me. My parents had supposedly been driving to seek help for our financial problems, but they had never mentioned any relatives or friends who might provide assistance. The car accident had happened in a remote area where they had no reason to be traveling. Most puzzling of all, there had been no investigation into their deaths, no insurance claims, no legal proceedings to settle their affairs. When I turned 18 and graduated from high school, I tried to research my parents' deaths more thoroughly. I found the newspaper article that Aunt Vivian had shown me, but it was brief and contained no details about the circumstances of the accident. I contacted the police department that had handled the case, but they said their records from that time period had been destroyed in a flood several years earlier. I hired a private investigator to look into my parents' background, but he found no trace of them after the day they left me in the casino. Aunt Vivian discouraged these investigations, saying that dwelling on the past was unhealthy and that I should focus on building my future rather than mourning people who were gone forever. She pointed out, correctly, that my parents had been struggling with serious problems that they had been unable or unwilling to solve, and that my life with her had provided opportunities that would never have been possible if they had lived. She was right about the practical benefits of my situation, but I still felt a persistent need to understand what had really happened during those final months of my childhood. College provided some distance from these questions, and for 4 years, I focused on my studies and my social life rather than my mysterious family history. I majored in business administration at Stanford, partially because Aunt Vivian encouraged it and partially because I genuinely enjoyed learning about finance and management. I made friends easily, dated casually, and generally lived the kind of normal college experience that had seemed impossible during my chaotic early childhood. But the questions about my parents never completely disappeared. Every year on the anniversary of their supposed deaths, I would spend hours searching online for any new information about the accident or their lives before they died. Every family holiday, I would wonder what they would have been like if they had lived, whether we would have maintained traditions, whether they would have been proud of my academic achievements and career plans. Aunt Vivian and I developed a close but somewhat formal relationship that worked well for both of us. She was proud of my accomplishments and generous with both advice and financial support. I was grateful for everything she had provided and tried to live up to her expectations and values. We talked regularly, spent holidays together, and shared interests in art and travel and business. But there was always an emotional distance between us that neither of us seemed able or willing to bridge completely. After college, I moved to San Francisco and started working for a corporate consulting firm that specialized in helping family businesses modernize their operations. The job was challenging and well paid, and I was good at analyzing complex financial situations and developing strategies for improving efficiency and profitability. Within 3 years, I had been promoted to senior consultant and was managing major client accounts independently. Aunt Vivian was pleased with my career progress and frequently asked about my work and my plans for advancement. She had built her own business from nothing and understood the challenges of establishing credibility and building client relationships in competitive industries. She also continued to provide financial advice and occasionally offered to invest in opportunities that might benefit my long-term career development. But our relationship remained somewhat distant despite our shared interests and mutual respect. Aunt Vivian had never been comfortable with emotional intimacy, and I had learned not to expect the kind of warm family connection that I saw among my friends and their relatives. We cared about each other, but we expressed that care through practical support rather than affection or deep personal conversations. This emotional distance made her sudden illness all the more shocking when it developed during my 5th year of working in San Francisco. Aunt Vivian had always been remarkably healthy and energetic, maintaining an active social life and traveling frequently for both business and pleasure. When she started experiencing fatigue and memory problems, she initially dismissed them as normal signs of aging. But when the symptoms worsened rapidly over a period of months, she was forced to seek medical attention. The diagnosis was early-onset Alzheimer's disease, a condition that would gradually rob her of her cognitive abilities and independence. The doctors estimated that she had perhaps 2 years before the disease would significantly impact her daily functioning, and maybe 5 years before she would require full-time care. For a woman who had built her identity around intelligence, competence, and self-reliance, the diagnosis was devastating. Aunt Vivian handled the news with characteristic practicality and determination. She immediately began organizing her affairs to ensure that her business and personal finances would be managed properly as her condition deteriorated. She updated her will, established medical directives, and arranged for professional care when it became necessary. She also insisted that I should not disrupt my career or personal life to become her caretaker, though she did ask me to visit more frequently and help with important decisions. Over the next 18 months, I watched the disease slowly steal away the sharp intellect and strong personality that had defined my great-aunt for decades. She remained dignified and determined, but her memory became unreliable and her ability to manage complex tasks gradually diminished. The successful business that she had built over 30 years had to be sold, and the social connections that had enriched her life became increasingly difficult to maintain. During this period, Aunt Vivian began sharing stories about her past that she had rarely discussed before. She talked about her childhood during the Great Depression, her struggles to establish her business in a male-dominated industry, and her decisions to remain single and childless in an era when those choices were considered unusual for women. She also began talking more about my parents and the circumstances that had brought me to live with her. But even as her inhibitions decreased due to the disease, Aunt Vivian remained careful about certain topics. When I asked direct questions about my parents' deaths or the details of how she had gained custody of me, she would become vague or change the subject. Sometimes she seemed to be on the verge of revealing important information, but then she would catch herself and retreat into safer conversational territory. The end came more quickly than anyone had expected. During my 7th year in San Francisco, Aunt Vivian developed pneumonia that her weakened immune system could not fight effectively. She spent 2 weeks in the hospital, most of it unconscious, before dying quietly on a Tuesday morning in February. I was holding her hand when she passed away, and her last words were an apology for secrets she said she should have shared but couldn't bring herself to reveal. The funeral was a dignified affair attended by her business associates, a few remaining friends, and the various professionals who had helped manage her care during her final months. I gave a eulogy that focused on her generosity, her intelligence, and her determination to create opportunities for others. But even as I spoke about my gratitude for everything she had provided, I felt frustrated by all the questions that would now never be answered. The reading of Aunt Vivian's will took place 1 week after the funeral in the offices of her longtime attorney, James Thompson. I had expected to inherit a modest amount of money and perhaps some personal items with sentimental value. Aunt Vivian had been wealthy, but she had also been generous with various charities and had supported several relatives over the years. Instead, I discovered that I was inheriting everything. The house, the remaining business assets, the investment portfolio, the art collection, and several $1 million in cash and securities. The total value of the estate was estimated at $12 million, making me instantly wealthy beyond anything I had ever imagined possible. But along with the inheritance came one final surprise that would change everything I thought I knew about my past. Thompson handed me a sealed envelope that Aunt Vivian had left with specific instructions that it should only be opened after her death and in my presence alone. Inside the envelope was a letter in her precise handwriting, along with a key to a safety deposit box that I had never known existed. The letter was brief but devastating in its implications. Aunt Vivian wrote that she had loved me like a daughter but had never been able to tell me the truth about how I had come to live with her. She said that everything I had been told about my parents' deaths had been a lie designed to protect me from more painful realities. She said that if I wanted to learn the truth, I should use the key to open the safety deposit box, but that I should be prepared for information that might be difficult to accept. Little did I know that the contents of that safety deposit box would reveal that my parents had not died in any accident. They had sold me for $15,000 to pay off their gambling debts, and they had been living just 2 hours away from me for the past 15 years. The safety deposit box was located in a downtown San Francisco bank that Aunt Vivian had used for decades. I arrived there 3 days after the funeral, still reeling from the implications of her letter and trying to prepare myself for whatever revelations awaited me. The bank manager, who had known Aunt Vivian personally, expressed his condolences and escorted me to the vault with an expression that suggested he knew this was no ordinary inheritance matter. The box was larger than I had expected, filled with manila folders, photographs, legal documents, and what appeared to be surveillance reports. But the first thing I noticed was another letter from Aunt Vivian, this one much longer and written in the shaky handwriting that had characterized her final months. She had clearly prepared this information knowing that her disease would eventually prevent her from explaining it in person. "My dearest Elaine," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means I have passed away and you have decided to learn the truth about your past. I pray that you will understand why I kept these secrets for so long, and that you will forgive me for the deception that allowed us to build a life together. Your parents did not die in a car accident 15 years ago. They are alive, and they have been living in Nevada this entire time, just 2 hours away from where you grew up." I had to set the letter down for a moment as the words sank in. My parents were alive. Everything I had believed about my childhood, my identity, and my family history had been built on a lie. The grief I had carried for 15 years, the questions that had haunted me throughout my adolescence, the acceptance I had finally achieved about being an orphan. All of it was false. But wait, it gets worse. I forced myself to continue reading, though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the pages steady. "Your parents did not lose you due to tragic circumstances or temporary desperation. They contacted me deliberately, through an intermediary, and proposed a transaction. They offered to sign over all parental rights to you in exchange for $15,000 and my promise never to reveal the truth about what had happened. They said they could not care for you properly due to their financial problems, and that you would have better opportunities if you were raised by someone with more resources." The cold, businesslike language of the explanation made the betrayal even more devastating. My parents had not abandoned me in a moment of panic or desperation. They had sold me like a piece of property, negotiating terms and signing contracts as if I were a commodity rather than their daughter. I was horrified by their proposal, Aunt Vivian's letter continued, but I was also concerned about your welfare. The intermediary showed me photographs of the conditions where you had been living, and it was clear that your parents were incapable of providing proper care. I agreed to their terms not because I wanted to buy a child, but because I wanted to save you from a situation that was only going to get worse. The next several pages detailed the legal arrangements that had been made to facilitate the transfer of custody. There had been forged documents claiming that my parents had died, false death certificates created by someone with connections to organized crime, and bribes paid to various officials to ensure that no one would investigate too closely. The entire operation had been orchestrated by Louis Barker, a man who specialized in helping people disappear when they owed money to dangerous creditors. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Aunt Vivian had not simply completed the transaction and forgotten about my parents. She had hired private investigators to monitor their activities for the past 15 years, documenting their lives and ensuring that they never attempted to contact me or interfere with my upbringing. The safety deposit box contained reports spanning over a decade, complete with photographs, financial records, and detailed observations about how my parents had spent the money they received for selling me. The first investigative report was dated 6 months after I had come to live with Aunt Vivian. It documented my parents living in a modest apartment in Reno, Nevada, having used the $15,000 to pay off their most pressing debts and relocate to a new city where their creditors could not easily find them. My father had found work in construction again, and my mother was working as a waitress. They appeared to be living quietly and making efforts to rebuild their lives. But subsequent reports revealed a different pattern. Within a year, my parents had returned to gambling, though more cautiously than before. They frequented casinos on weekends, played poker in underground games, and gradually accumulated new debts despite their steady employment. The investigators documented multiple instances where they had discussed me, wondering whether I was adapting well to my new life and whether Aunt Vivian would be willing to provide updates about my progress. Even more disturbing were the records showing that my parents had attempted to contact Aunt Vivian several times over the years, always around holidays or my birthday, asking for photographs or information about my development. Aunt Vivian had consistently refused these requests, maintaining that our agreement included no contact provisions for my own protection. The investigators noted that these attempts at contact usually coincided with periods when my parents were experiencing financial stress. By the time I was 12, the reports showed that my parents had started a new family. My mother had given birth to a son, Daniel, and 2 years later to a daughter, Sarah. The photographs in the file showed them at various family events, appearing happy and stable in ways that I remembered from my early childhood. They had bought a house, maintained steady employment, and seemed to have learned to manage their gambling impulses more effectively. This revelation was particularly painful because it suggested that my parents had been capable of providing proper care for children. They had simply chosen not to do so for me. Daniel and Sarah had grown up with the love and stability that had been taken away from me, not because my parents were incapable of providing it, but because they had found it more convenient to sell me rather than address their problems. The most recent reports, dating from just 6 months before Aunt Vivian's death, showed that my parents were still living in the same house in Reno. My father was now a supervisor at a construction company, and my mother worked part-time at a local school. Daniel was 15 and played basketball at his high school. Sarah was 13 and took piano lessons. They lived ordinary middle-class lives, with family vacations, birthday parties, and the kind of normal family dynamics that I had always wondered about. But the reports also documented something else that made my blood run cold. My parents had been following news about Aunt Vivian's business success and my own academic achievements. They knew she was wealthy, they knew I had graduated from Stanford, and they knew I was working for a successful consulting firm in San Francisco. The investigators had observed them discussing whether my inheritance might provide opportunities for reconnecting with me, particularly if Aunt Vivian's reported health problems proved to be serious. The final document in the safety deposit box was a letter that Aunt Vivian had written but never sent, dated just 3 months before her death. It was addressed to my parents and informed them that she was terminally ill and that I would inherit her entire estate. She warned them that any attempts to contact me would be met with legal action, and that she had arranged for continued surveillance even after her death to ensure my protection. But she had never sent the letter, apparently deciding that direct communication might only encourage them to act more quickly on whatever plans they were developing. Instead, she had left everything to me to discover and handle as I saw fit. I spent hours in that bank vault, reading through 15 years of reports and trying to process the magnitude of the deception that had shaped my entire life. The parents I had mourned were alive and living comfortable lives just 2 hours away. The tragic accident that had explained their disappearance was a complete fabrication. The financial desperation that had supposedly driven them to make desperate choices had been resolved within months of selling me, allowing them to build the stable family life that they had denied me. When I finally left the bank, I felt emotionally numb and completely uncertain about what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to drive immediately to Reno and confront my parents with the evidence of their betrayal. Part of me wanted to pretend I had never opened the safety deposit box and continue living with the comfortable lies that had protected me for 15 years. But I also knew that ignoring this information was impossible now that I understood the truth. I spent the next week trying to decide how to handle the situation. I consulted with James Thompson, Aunt Vivian's attorney, who confirmed that all the legal arrangements surrounding my adoption had been properly executed and that my parents had no claim to my inheritance or any legal standing to challenge Aunt Vivian's will. He also informed me that the private investigation firm that had been monitoring my parents was still under contract and could provide current information about their activities if I wanted to continue the surveillance. But the decision was taken out of my hands when I returned home from work one evening to find 2 people standing on my doorstep. Even though 15 years had passed and they looked older and more worn than I remembered, I recognized them immediately. My parents had found me. My mother was the first to speak, and her voice carried the same tone of desperate emotion that I remembered from our final days together. "Elaine, sweetheart, we have been searching for you for so long. We thought you were dead. We thought Vivian had died years ago and that we would never see you again." My father stepped forward with tears in his eyes, reaching out as if to embrace me. "We never stopped loving you, honey. Not for a single day. We have thought about you every morning and prayed for you every night. When we heard about Vivian's death in the newspaper, we knew we had to find you and tell you how sorry we are. Their performance was convincing, I had to admit. If I had not spent the previous week reading detailed reports about their lives, I might have been moved by their apparent grief and regret. But knowing what I knew about their comfortable life in Reno, their new family, and their awareness of my inheritance, I could see their reunion attempt for what it really was. We have so much to explain, my mother continued, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. So much to apologize for. We were young and scared and made terrible mistakes. But we want to make up for lost time. We want to be a family again. I looked at these two people who had given me life and then sold me for $15,000, and I felt a strange calmness settle over me. I had spent 15 years wondering about this moment, imagining what I would say if I ever saw them again. Now that it was actually happening, I knew exactly what needed to be done. That's interesting, I said quietly. Because I have been doing some research about our family history, and I discovered some information that I think you should see. I invited them into my apartment, noting how their eyes immediately began cataloguing the expensive furnishings and artwork that reflected my inheritance from Aunt Vivian. They sat on my couch with expressions of hopeful expectation, clearly anticipating an emotional reunion and probably already planning how to position themselves for access to my newfound wealth. Instead, I went to my bedroom and retrieved the manila folders that I had brought home from the safety deposit box. I set them on the coffee table between us and opened the first one to reveal a photograph of my parents standing outside their house in Reno, taken just 6 months earlier. The look of shock that crossed their faces was immediately replaced by panic as they realized that their carefully constructed story was about to collapse. Before you continue with your explanation about searching for me all these years, I said calmly, maybe you could help me understand these photographs. This one shows you at Daniel's basketball game last month. This one shows Sarah's piano recital 3 weeks ago. And this one shows both of you celebrating your 20th wedding anniversary at a restaurant in Reno last year. My father's face had gone completely white, while my mother was staring at the photographs as if they were evidence of a crime. Which, in many ways, they were. I have 15 years of similar documentation, I continued. Reports showing exactly where you have been living, what jobs you have held, what cars you have driven, and what family activities you have enjoyed. I know about Daniel and Sarah. I know about your house on Pine Street. I know about your gambling activities and your financial situation. Most importantly, I know that you have never once been searching for me. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents sat frozen on my couch, their reunion performance completely abandoned as they tried to process how their plan had gone so wrong so quickly. I also know about Lewis Barker, I added, opening another folder. I know about the $15,000. I know about the forged death certificates. And I know that you sold me to pay off your gambling debts before starting a new family that you managed to keep together just fine. That's when everything changed. The fake tears disappeared, replaced by anger and desperation as my parents realized that their attempt at manipulation had failed completely. You don't understand what we were going through, my father said, his voice becoming defensive. We were in danger. We had borrowed money from people who would have hurt all of us if we hadn't paid them back. So you sold your 7-year-old daughter instead of getting jobs and paying off your debts like responsible adults, I replied. And then you used the money to relocate and start fresh, which suggests that you could have done the same thing without selling me. My mother tried a different approach, her voice becoming pleading and manipulative. Elaine, you have to understand that we were desperate. We thought Vivian could give you opportunities that we never could. We thought it was the best thing for you. If you really believed that, why didn't you ever check to see how I was doing? I asked. Aunt Vivian documented multiple attempts by you to get information about my progress, but you never once asked if I was happy or if I missed you. You only asked for information when you were having financial problems. The conversation continued for another hour, with my parents alternating between fake emotions, defensive justifications, and increasingly desperate attempts to convince me that their actions had been motivated by love rather than selfishness. But every argument they made was contradicted by the evidence in the folders, and eventually they realized that their reunion strategy was not going to work. That's when they revealed their true motivation for seeking me out after Aunt Vivian's death. "Look, Elaine," my father said, his voice becoming harder and more businesslike. "We know Vivian left you millions of dollars. We're your parents. We have rights. And we have information that could make things very difficult for you if you don't cooperate." There it was. The real reason for their sudden reappearance and emotional performance. They weren't seeking reconciliation or forgiveness. They were attempting extortion. "What kind of information?" I asked calmly, though my heart was racing. My mother leaned forward with a cold smile that I had never seen on her face before. "Vivian wasn't the saint you think she was. We know things about how she got her money, about the people she hurt along the way. If we start talking to reporters about what really happened, her precious reputation will be destroyed. And yours will be too, when people find out you're living off blood money." It was a desperate bluff, and they knew it. But they were counting on my emotional attachment to Aunt Vivian's memory to make me vulnerable to their threats. "You're welcome to try that approach," I replied. "But before you do, you should probably understand what resources I have available to respond." I opened another folder and pulled out a document that I had prepared the previous day, after consulting with James Thompson about my legal options. "This is a restraining order that will be filed tomorrow morning if either of you attempts to contact me again or makes any public statements about our family." I read from the document. "It includes detailed evidence of your abandonment, the fraudulent circumstances of my adoption, and your current attempt to extort money from me. If you violate this order, you will be arrested." My father's face flushed with anger. "You can't prove any of that. It's your word against ours." "Actually," I said, reaching for my phone, "everything we've discussed tonight has been recorded. California is a one-party consent state, which means I can legally record conversations in my own home. Between this recording and 15 years of investigative reports, I have more evidence against you than most prosecutors need for criminal convictions." The mention of criminal charges clearly rattled them, but my mother tried one more approach. "What about Daniel and Sarah?" she asked, her voice becoming desperate. "They don't know about any of this. Do you really want to destroy their lives by exposing family secrets that will devastate them?" This was perhaps their most manipulative tactic yet. They were using my half-siblings, who were innocent victims of our parents' choices, as emotional leverage to prevent me from seeking justice. "Daniel and Sarah deserve to know the truth about what kind of people their parents are," I replied. "But that's a conversation you'll need to have with them, not me." We stood up to leave, but my father made one final threat as they reached the door. "This isn't over, Elaine. We brought you into this world, and we have rights that no court can take away. If you think you can just ignore us and keep all that money for yourself, you're making a big mistake." "Actually," I said, "I think you'll find that selling your parental rights for $15,000 eliminated most of your legal standing. But if you want to test that theory in court, I'm prepared for that battle." After they left, I sat in my apartment trying to process what had just happened. The parents I had mourned for 15 years had returned not to apologize or reconnect, but to threaten and extort me. The grief I had carried about their deaths had been replaced by anger about their betrayal, but also by a strange sense of liberation. I finally knew the truth about my past, and I could stop wondering about what might have been. But I also knew that this confrontation was not the end of the situation. My parents were clearly desperate for money, and desperate people often make dangerous choices. I needed to be prepared for whatever they might try next. The next morning, I filed the restraining order as promised and increased the security at my apartment building. I also contacted the private investigation firm that had been monitoring my parents and arranged for continued surveillance, both for my protection and to document any illegal activities they might attempt. James Thompson advised me to prepare for the possibility that my parents might try to challenge Aunt Vivian's will, claiming that she had no legal right to adopt me or that the adoption had been fraudulent. Such a challenge would almost certainly fail, given the extensive documentation of the legal arrangements, but it could tie up my inheritance in court for months or years. More concerning was the possibility that my parents might attempt to extort money from me by threatening to expose embarrassing information about Aunt Vivian or me. Even if their threats were baseless, the resulting publicity could damage my career and personal relationships. I decided that the best defense was a proactive offense. Instead of waiting for my parents to act, I would control the narrative by revealing the truth about my past on my own terms. I spent the next week crafting a detailed account of my childhood abandonment, Aunt Vivian's rescue, and my parents' recent extortion attempt. I submitted this account to a journalist who specialized in investigative reporting about family fraud and financial crimes. The resulting article would protect me from future blackmail attempts while also exposing my parents' behavior to public scrutiny. But before the article could be published, my parents made a move that I had not anticipated. They contacted Daniel and Sarah directly, telling them about my existence and claiming that I had stolen money that rightfully belonged to their family. I learned about this development when Daniel called me at work 3 days after my parents' visit. His voice was confused and angry as he tried to understand how he could have a sister he had never known about. "Is it true?" he asked without preamble. "Are you really our sister? And did our parents really sell you when you were 7 years old?" "Yes," I replied. "It's all true. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Mom and Dad say you have millions of dollars that should be shared with the whole family," Daniel continued. "They say you're being selfish by keeping everything for yourself." I could hear the manipulation in their parents' approach. They were positioning me as the villain who was depriving Daniel and Sarah of opportunities and financial security. It was the same emotional manipulation they had tried to use on me, but applied to children who had no context for understanding the situation. "Daniel," I said carefully, "I'd like to meet you and Sarah in person so we can talk about this properly. There are things about our parents that you need to understand, and I think it would be better if we had that conversation face to face." "I'm not supposed to talk to you," Daniel replied. "Mom and Dad said you might try to turn us against them." The fact that my parents were trying to prevent their other children from communicating with me suggested that they were afraid of what Daniel and Sarah might learn about their character and history. "I understand that they're concerned," I said. "But you're 15 years old, and Sarah is 13. You're both old enough to hear the truth and make your own decisions about our family situation." We arranged to meet the following Saturday at a restaurant in Reno, without our parents' knowledge. I drove the 2 hours from San Francisco, bringing copies of the investigative reports and legal documents that would help explain the situation. Daniel and Sarah were waiting for me when I arrived, and the resemblance between us was immediately obvious despite the 15-year age gap. They both had the same dark hair and green eyes that I remembered from childhood photographs, and Sarah had inherited our mother's delicate features while Daniel had our father's broader build. The conversation was difficult and emotional, but I tried to present the facts as clearly and objectively as possible. I showed them the investigative reports that documented our parents' comfortable life in Reno while I had been growing up in California. I explained the legal arrangements that had transferred custody to Aunt Vivian, and I described the extortion attempt that had taken place in my apartment the previous week. Sarah was the first to speak after I finished my explanation. "So our parents lied to us about having another daughter, and they sold you for money?" "Yes," I confirmed. "And they only contacted me after they learned about my inheritance, not because they missed me or wanted to rebuild our relationship." Daniel was struggling to process the information, his loyalty to our parents conflicting with the evidence I had presented. "But they're good parents to us," he said defensively. "They've always taken care of us and supported our activities. Maybe they made mistakes when they were younger, but people can change." "You're right that people can change," I agreed. "And I'm glad they've been good parents to you. But their current attempt to extort money from me suggests that they haven't changed as much as you might hope." I spent 2 hours with Daniel and Sarah, answering their questions and helping them understand the complexity of our family situation. By the end of our conversation, they were both upset about our parents' deception, but they were also conflicted about what to do with this information. "We want to have a relationship with you," Sarah said finally. "But we don't want to destroy our family either." "I understand that this puts you in a difficult position," I replied. "I don't want you to choose between me and our parents. But I also can't allow them to manipulate or threaten me." We agreed to stay in contact and to meet again in a few weeks, giving Daniel and Sarah time to process what they had learned and decide how they wanted to handle the situation with our parents. But our parents discovered our meeting when Daniel accidentally mentioned it during a family dinner. According to the investigative reports I received later, they were furious that I had contacted their children and convinced that I was trying to turn Daniel and Sarah against them. Their response was swift and vindictive. They hired Lewis Barker, the same man who had arranged my original sale 15 years earlier, to help them develop a strategy for claiming a share of my inheritance. Barker's approach was more sophisticated than my parents' amateur extortion attempts. He filed legal papers claiming that Aunt Vivian's adoption of me had been fraudulent and that my parents had been coerced into giving up their parental rights under duress. He also threatened to expose what he claimed were illegal activities in Aunt Vivian's business dealings, though he provided no evidence to support these allegations. Most concerning, Barker began following me and taking photographs, clearly gathering information for some kind of harassment campaign. The private investigators monitoring the situation reported that he had been asking questions about my work, my friends, and my daily routines. James Thompson assured me that Barker's legal challenges were groundless and would be dismissed once they came before a judge. But he also warned me that Barker was known for using intimidation tactics and had connections to organized crime figures who might be willing to escalate the situation beyond legal proceedings. That's when I decided it was time to end this situation permanently. Instead of continuing to react to my parents' attacks, I would take control of the situation and force a final resolution. I arranged a meeting with Daniel and Sarah without telling them that our parents and Lewis Barker would also be present. I wanted all the key players in the same room so that everything could be settled once and for all. The meeting took place in James Thompson's conference room, where I had requested additional security and arranged for everything to be recorded. When my parents and Barker arrived and discovered that Daniel and Sarah were already there, they immediately realized that their strategy had backfired. I began by addressing Daniel and Sarah directly. I wanted you to hear everything that's about to be discussed so you can understand exactly what kind of people raised you. Then I turned to my parents and Barker. You have two choices. You can accept a settlement offer that I'm prepared to make right now, or you can continue with your legal challenges and harassment campaign. But if you choose the second option, I will respond with everything I have. What kind of settlement? Barker asked suspiciously. $50,000, I replied. Final payment. No future contact. No additional claims against my inheritance. And most importantly, no attempts to involve Daniel and Sarah in your financial schemes. That's nowhere near what we deserve, my father protested. You inherited millions because of what we sacrificed. You sacrificed nothing, I replied. You sold me for $15,000 and used that money to start fresh. I'm offering you more than 3 times what you originally received, which is far more generous than you deserve. My mother looked at Daniel and Sarah, clearly calculating whether she could continue to use them as emotional leverage. What about our children? She asked. Don't they deserve a share of family money? That's not your decision to make, I said. When Daniel and Sarah turn 18, they can contact me if they want to discuss their future. But any relationship I have with them will be independent of anything involving you. Barker tried to interject with threats about exposing alleged crimes, but I cut him off. Mr. Barker, I said, I know about your role in arranging my original sale. I know about the forged documents and the bribes that were paid to facilitate the adoption. If you continue to harass me, I will provide all of this information to federal authorities who are already investigating your other activities. The mention of federal investigation was a bluff, but Barker's reaction suggested that he had good reason to be concerned about law enforcement attention. The room fell silent as my parents and Barker realized that their strategy had completely collapsed. They had expected to find me isolated and vulnerable, but instead they were facing documented evidence of their crimes and the possibility of serious legal consequences. Take the settlement, Daniel said suddenly, his voice carrying a maturity that surprised everyone in the room. Take the money and leave Elaine alone. Sarah nodded in agreement. She doesn't owe us anything. You sold her. She has every right to hate us. My parents looked at their children, perhaps recognizing for the first time the full scope of what their choices had cost them. They had not only lost me 15 years ago, but they were now losing the respect and trust of Daniel and Sarah as well. The settlement was signed within an hour. $50,000 in exchange for permanent relinquishment of any claims against my inheritance or future contact with me. Barker agreed to cease all harassment activities in exchange for my promise not to report his past crimes to authorities. But the most important outcome of the meeting was not the financial settlement. It was the conversation I had with Daniel and Sarah afterward, when our parents had left and we could speak privately. "I want you to know that I don't blame either of you for our parents' choices," I told them. "You were just children when all this happened. If you want to have a relationship with me as adults, that possibility will always exist." Sarah hugged me for the first time, and I felt a connection to family that was based on choice rather than obligation. Daniel was more reserved, but he shook my hand and said, "I'm sorry about what they did to you. And I'm glad you survived it and built a good life." As I drove back to San Francisco that evening, I reflected on how much my understanding of family had changed over the past month. The people who had given me life had also betrayed and abandoned me for money. The woman who had taken me in as a stranger had provided more love and support than my biological parents ever had. And the siblings I had just met might become closer to me than the people who had raised us. Family, I realized, was not just about blood relationships or legal obligations. It was about choice, commitment, and the daily decisions we make to care for each other. Aunt Vivian had chosen to be my family when my parents chose to abandon that responsibility. Daniel and Sarah were choosing to build a relationship with me despite the pain it might cause with our parents. 6 months later, I received a letter from Sarah telling me about her high school achievements and asking for advice about college applications. Daniel sent me a text on my birthday, saying he hoped we could meet again soon. Our parents had made no further contact, apparently having learned that their manipulation tactics would not work against someone who understood their true character. I used part of my inheritance to establish a scholarship fund for children who had been abandoned or abused by their families. It seemed like an appropriate way to honor Aunt Vivian's memory while helping other young people who had experienced similar trauma. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the relationship I began building with Daniel and Sarah. We met every few months, usually without our parents' knowledge, and slowly developed the kind of sibling bond that should have existed throughout our childhood. They were good kids who had been raised by people with serious character flaws, but they were choosing to define themselves by their own values rather than their parents' failures. In many ways, they reminded me of myself at their age, trying to build an identity separate from a family history that was complicated and painful. The last I heard from our parents was a Christmas card that arrived 2 years after our final meeting. It contained no message, just their signatures and a return address showing they had moved to Arizona. I wondered if they had finally learned to live within their means, or if they had simply found new ways to create problems for themselves. But their absence from my life felt like freedom rather than loss. I had spent 15 years mourning people who were not worth mourning, and now I could focus on building relationships with people who actually deserved my time and energy. Have you ever had to choose between toxic family members and your own well-being? Have you found that the family you choose can be stronger than the family you were born into? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more stories about family betrayal, survival, and the power of choosing your own path. Remember that you are not obligated to maintain relationships with people who hurt you, regardless of whether you share DNA. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it inspires you to prioritize your own healing and happiness over family loyalty that has not been earned.